The role and relevance of interdisciplinary research in community activism in a post-Brexit United Kingdom. Well, I thought that I would actually give you a sense of where I come from, present to you a sort of scrapbook of my work, and hopefully try and piece that all together to make sense of that rather dry and academic title. So, wish me luck. A little bit about myself. So, I'm a visiting research fellow at MMU, and I'm the academic lead for the Critical Race and Ethnicity Research Cluster. And I'll explain more about that as we go along. So, why do I do what I do? Plus, sort of shameless plug for my latest book, which will sort of become sort of quite apparent. So, in this book, I think this is the first publication of mine that really combines my community activism and grounds my studies into critical race in my embedded research in the community. So we will come back to that, and Selma James is actually a key component of this sort of melding of practice and theory. So I consider myself a scholar activist, and in preparing for this talk I was sort of thinking, well, what does that actually mean? And I sort of looked at what it meant in terms of my practice over the years. So I've broken that down into three main areas as I see them: social justice, knowledge, and agency. So, thinking about social justice, in terms of my personal background, I come from what could be described as a marginal communities, BME communities. In my piece for Open Democracy, I write about my background in terms of the struggles that I had at school and being consigned to the scrap heap of low attainment, and the structural inequalities of the education system. My mother having to go to my schools to question teachers as to why they were marking me below the marks that I knew and she knew that I was capable of. So the whole sort of struggle of that. My mum, being a single parent at the time, having to work multiple jobs to kind of fund my ambitions to become a classical musician. So at the time, that was sort of quite a rare thing. In fact, it still is quite a rare thing. There's a huge debate around classical music and music in general being taught in the syllabus at school, and why classical music is still overwhelmingly white. So 30 years on, we're still kind of talking about that, which is quite worrying. But from my point of view, having to find the money to pay for my private tuition, finding the money to pay for my instruments, I owned my own clarinet. Then, as the years rolled on, my mum went to university, well, Polytechnic in the day, she went to MMU, and so the struggles with education there. But for me, I was very lucky because I come from a very aspirational Afro-Caribbean family where education is everything. So I was surrounded by books. I was helped by the Manchester Education Committee at the time, where we had the Manchester Youth Orchestra, the Manchester Wind Band, and all the little suburban wind bands that I played in. So I had access to all of these sort of extracurricular activities, musical extracurricular activities, which suited me just fine. So growing up, there was this whole thing about, well, you do have to be better than your contemporary white peers. And it wasn't really explained to me, other than sort of racism per se, why I had to be better. But throughout my upbringing, I was sort of really pushed quite hard to do well at school and to kind of get as good an education as possible. So of course, these type of systemic issues are really key when we talk about social justice, particularly if we're talking about marginalised communities. So in my book chapter, The Ethical Implications of Ideological and Political Multiculturalism in the UK, really when we start talking about citizenization and who we are as citizens, we actually automatically start talking about issues around social justice and structural inequalities. So I sort of had throughout my childhood and indeed my adult life had experience, sort of quite personal experience of striving for social justice. So talking about resistance to what? Knowledge of the system, or as Bell Hooks calls it, the patriarchal terrorism. So in my piece, What's the Problem with Black Masculinities, I sort of locate that image and many images like it as a visual representation of a racial patriarchy in terms of black man. He's obviously racialized as black and fetishized with that image, and that image really does kind of portray what we're fighting against in terms of black masculinity and hypermasculinities and hypersexualities, hyperviolence, and all of the kind of systemic problems that flow from a sort of holding image like that. So of course, I expand on this in my book, Urban Dialectics, The Market and Youth Engagement. And I also examine the relationship between blackness and whiteness and exactly what whiteness is in kind of psychoanalytical terms in my book chapter, International Perspectives of Multiculturalism. So I am giving you a kind of sketch. I'm not going to go into any of the critical race theories because that's going to be an entirely different talk. But I am sort of trying to map out the terrain of my brand of scholar activism. So we have social justice, we have knowledge. So for me, knowledge has to somehow produce agency. There's really no point having knowledge of the system and not being able to do anything about it. So as a composer, which was my first port of call in academia many moons ago, I worked as a community music specialist. I had my own sort of, if you will, community music organisation called the Revelation Collective. So we were a collective of artists who combined their commissioned work with their community work. So we worked across virtually all sectors of the community using music. It was a music collective, and Revelation Community Arts was the specific vehicle that we used to go into schools and youth clubs. So as a composer, just to kind of show you some of the things that I did do, very interested in race and ethnicity. My string quartet there, What Has Happened to All That Beauty, was inspired by the 1995 Million Man March in Washington. And it was also inspired by James Baldwin's collection of essays, The Fire Next Time. And his second essay was What Will Happen to All That Beauty. So of course, he was talking to his nephew about the social inequalities of 1960s America. And one of the reasons why I kind of bring this to your attention is that to African Americans now, James Baldwin, it's sort of very sad because times do not seem to have moved as significantly as one would have hoped between the days of the civil rights movement when James Baldwin was writing to his nephew to what we have today with the police brutality that's happening on the streets over there. And then tribute to Mr. King, that was sort of based on the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, especially in 1997 when Jack Straw reopened the case to visit that. So I wrote a piece based around some of those themes in my organ work, premiered in the festival, Edinburgh Festival, did some community workshops around the themes. More agency, again as a composer, some of my interests in environmental issues and in disability. So my piece for string quartet, Hidden Song, was really very much about the plight of the Amazonian rainforest. That resulted in a commission from the Scottish Chamber Orchestra and a string quartet called Quants from the Scottish Chamber Orchestra premiered my piece. Again, that was buttressed by community workshops with schools, this particular project. And then Longstone Masterpieces, that is a video of a music video directed and produced by adults with learning disabilities that I worked with at the time. So what's interesting for me about working with adults with disabilities, well, there are two things. First thing, this young looking chap there, I don't quite know what I was doing there, but I was obviously sort of doing something quite energetic. That took place at the Queen's Hall in Edinburgh, where I spent my formative years as a student and as a young professional. And that residency was their first education outreach project. So I helped to shape their education work from those very early days. Now, back in the day, so today it is really, really commonplace. Everybody, all organisations, arts organisations have elements of education work and outreach. But in the early 90s, late 80s, actually that wasn't the case. So one project I was involved with was the Glasgow Celebration of Cultures in 1991 with the Scottish Chamber Orchestra. And we were a group of postgraduate students, and we went out into the community under the leadership of Nigel Osborne, who was my supervisor at the time, the great Nigel Osborne. He's still alive, I don't quite know why I'm saying that as though it's an obituary. We worked with various community groups, and then we wrote pieces that combined the work we did with those community groups with the Scottish Chamber Orchestra. So the community group I worked with was the Tollcross Adult Training Centre, which had adults who were on sort of various parts of the autistic spectrum. And what we did with them, we taught them Tibetan overtone singing in our workshops, and then I combined the Tibetan overtone singing in the workshops with the Scottish Chamber Orchestra and wrote this very colourful sort of piece that had our adults at the centre of it. And that was quite revolutionary. At the time, at the premiere of that piece, the future education officers from the BBC Phil and the Halle were there. And I do feel sort of quite proud to be part of a cohort of young composers working in the community who kind of were in the vanguard of establishing that work, which is now incredibly commonplace. And then thirdly, my work in mental health. So in fact, I'm just going to play you a song from the Abbey Tracks album from the Northstoke Cams. One of my favourite songs on the album. So just a little indulgent moment. for me, hugely moving song, obviously because I was part of the project and the executive producer, but witnessing the journey of that young man, for him to actually write and sing about his mental health issues, yeah, quite remarkable, quite moving. So, so far, this is more activist than scholar. So it was during my time working on the Sonic Decibel Music Technology in Prisons project in HMP YOI Warrington, a young offenders institution, that I really became sort of cognizant of the need to somehow explore the scholarship behind the activism. So before I tell you more about the project, I'm going to play you an excerpt from a BBC interview, and you'll be able to hear one of the inmates describe the significance of this project to him. That project was really, that marked the beginning of my inquiry into social justice, because the young men were writing these songs and the lyrics were sort of full of references to gang culture, homophobic content, misogynistic content, and it was through the creative writing sessions that we held that we were really able to begin to address some of the reasons why these young men were writing what they were writing, and really trying to get them to see themselves not just stereotypes or just as a number, but as human beings with real agency, so that they could possibly, when they left, begin to make choices, better choices. So lots of the young men really began to realise just how important their families were to them. So being locked away and away from their families just began to humanise them, and they began to see their masculinities as being bound to their families and having family commitments and missing out on family life, supporting their parents or their sisters or their partners or their children. So through that project, it really kind of got me thinking, okay, so the young men are discussing these issues around masculinities, around race, around sexuality. What are the sort of critical theories? So that kind of really got me turned on to researching and developing myself as a scholar in critical race studies, because for the first time I saw that this knowledge of the academy was actually really important in terms of beginning to apply that to the groups that I was working with. So from then on, I kind of embarked on this journey of trying to create a bridge between the academy and communities. I won't bother playing you an excerpt of one of their songs because of time. Okay. So this scholar activism, or this sort of awakening of theoretical interest, really became embedded in my practice in community education. So in 2013, we at MMU were holding a series of community engagement events to try and prepare the local community in Hume for the new building, what's now called the Brooks building. It used to be called the Burley campus. As you can imagine, there was an enormous amount of resistance to that campus being built in that place. The campus is built on Burley Fields, which is a historic part of Hume with a 110-year-old tree which had to be cut down, and of course the residents weren't really happy with that, and 10,000 signature petitions and protests were circulating. So I was working with the community just opposite the campus at the Hume Hippodrome, and looking at whether we could turn that building, get funding, bring the community together, turn that building into a community resource. As these things happen, it's just never as it never runs as smoothly as you would like. But the process itself of working with the communities really sort of got me embedded within the local communities and the local issues. So in 2013, the community said to us as a university, we are very interested in raising the educational attainment of our young people. How can you help us do that? So we thought, okay, as part of our engagement, why don't we put on a conference that looks at the different modes, the different models of education that you possibly could have access to. So we examined free schools, the pros and cons of free schools, cooperative schools, studio schools, supplementary schools, aka Saturday schools, arts-led special schools, specialist schools, and we looked at education as a form of protest. So we debated the pros and cons, and then the community came back to me and said, actually, we're not too impressed with free schools and cooperative schools. We have our own homegrown model of community education, and that's supplementary education, Saturday schools. So we've had, I think, we have one of the oldest African and Caribbean supplementary schools in the country, the WIOCC, the West Indian Organising Coordinating Committee, that was established in 1964. So the WIOCC and a couple of other schools said to me, okay, we've listened to all these different models. What we would like from you as a university is support in helping us strengthen our delivery of basically community education. We would like help in terms of, can you train our teachers so that they can deliver their classes more effectively? So went back to education and talked to the head of CPD at the time. We had lots of meetings, myself, community representatives in education, and we put together a program of CPD for supplementary school teachers, a PG cert in teaching and learning, which we have fashioned to meet the particular needs of the supplementary school sector. Now, all of that process of the ethical and philosophical issues around basically what we're talking about is the marketisation of education. That's in the book, and the process of how we came together to form a consortium is mapped out in the book. So for me, this really did mark the beginning of the theory as a scholar actually being embedded in a community setting, producing real agency. Because of course, through that, we're talking about education acting as a driver for urban regeneration for the communities that those schools serve. And also, if we talk about supplementary schools, one of the big things which I learned, because prior to this conference, I didn't really know anything about supplementary schools. It was just kind of as I journeyed with my community partners. So that supplementary schools deliver more services than just education. So, you know, they often run employment clubs, local health services, food banks, cafes. So they are real community hubs, and they happen to do community education as well. So my thought as an activist and as a researcher was looking into, okay, how exactly can education become a real driver for community development, local grassroots community development? So don't really have any answers, but as you will hear, I'm going to introduce you to a couple of our members. We are kind of working that out as we go along. Just rather interestingly, That was 3 years ago. So earlier on this year, MEEP held its first education symposium, and that's a video that's about to start. So in this symposium, we introduced the schools within the hub. We talked about the relevance of the Educational Excellence Everywhere paper to the supplementary sector. We looked at enterprise education, that's Esther up there, Journey to a Successful Career. We talked about mentorship and community mentorship in education as well. In our plenary, which I think that's about to start, we looked at culture and heritage and the role of that in pedagogical processes. So we might be able to come back to that in the Q&A. So let's get... So yes, MEEP does mark a full sort of circled return to my experience of mainstream education and looking at the power of education as a site of resistance and as an inherent political statement. So as you can see, my papers there about the white paper, Educational Excellence Everywhere, how supplementary schools can help to answer what education is for, and looking at education playing its part in tackling social inequalities. We have a page on the critical race and ethnicity cluster, so you can sort of visit that for more details. Okay, so this is now bringing us really up to date and going to sort of really show how the sort of interdisciplinarity of my research is applied in the community. So back to the book, the polemics of Selma James and the contemporary black activism. It all started last year when a community member noticed that our heritage community resource centre, the Selma James Centre, was up for sale. It had fallen into, as I say, disrepair, but it was a really vibrant, in its time, it really was a vibrant community hub for the African and Caribbean community, and we really couldn't understand why it was allowed to fall into disrepair. So we formed a Friends of Selma James, and we organised awareness raising activities, protests, fun days, and community meetings where we approached the community and we said to them, so what do you want from this building? What services are you looking at? So we're looking at education, having a school there, sort of creche facilities, a kitchen for older people to kind of service the cafe, but also train in catering, and a very, very small arts provision, like a music stroke art gallery for the local BME artists in Wally Range. So as you can see, it was sort of a bit of a sad state of affairs. So in order to manage this part of the campaign, we did set up the Friends of Selma James Community Forum. So throughout that, with all of these competing demands and community agendas which we had to navigate, we slowly meandered our way to setting up the Selma James Community Action Trust. But before I tell you a little bit about that, we were really, really honoured to have Selma James. So bit of background. Selma James Centre, named after the black activist and intellectual Selma James, who worked in Manchester in the mid-1930s, on his way, I guess, to America, because he kind of went to Lancashire first and then took a job for the Manchester Guardian. Vanessa Redgrave, she had political ambitions in the 70s, and CLR James was a mentor of hers. So she then bought the building and bequeathed it to the local communities in Whalley Range and named it after CLR James. And his pet name is Nello, hence the Nello James Centre. So we were really, really honoured to have his widow come up to Manchester and lend us her support. And one of the things that really, really struck me and really kind of brought to life the bridge between the academy and the community was CLR James. People, until this campaign, weren't really aware of who CLR James was and what he stood for. But through the campaign, they were reading his works, especially his famous Black Jacobins, describing the revolution in Santo Domingo, because they sort of really associated that with a revolution in the community, with saving this building. And it was through engaging with the spirit of CLR James and his works that they began to, as I've written there, kind of enter into a process of conscientization where they were sort of problematizing structural issues around council support. Why as a black asset was this allowed to run into the ground? What sort of support was there? What were the structural things within the council and the community that we weren't able to access as a community to keep the building going? So we had incredibly lively community meetings, and it was a bit of a roller coaster, to be honest, of juggling all of the conflicting interests and community agendas. But to try to focus that into agency, which is kind of my third pillar, if we remember, we had to set up the CLR James Community Action Trust. So we carried out a skills audit from the Friends of the Nello James Forum, and then formed this Action Trust, a charity, with the express purpose of doing the nitty-gritty work of writing business plans and funding applications and working with local stakeholders, including the council and the housing associations in the area, to see what we could do with the plot of land. So we did have to kind of narrow that down into a little steering group. And then from this project, we decided to organise a piece of applied research based on my book, Urban Dialectics, The Market and Youth Engagement, which really talks about youth culture, neoliberalism, race, and its implications on democracy. So young people engaged with themes from the book and wrote a song about that, about how they felt they were being represented in the media as young black people. So we worked with the BBC, and which was very, very useful, and we were part of the Being Human Festival. So we thought, well, would a project of this kind, a music and video project, really have an impact on their perceptions of crime and offending behaviour and well-being? So it was a sort of project within a project, and I'll kind of explain the significance of that in a minute. So just a very, very, very brief research outline. 16 to 24-year-olds, we had 20 young people from the Blackpool and Greater Manchester areas. It was a quasi-experimental design. Some of the people were self-selecting because they actually applied. We put out ads, and people kind of rang our leader for this project in terms of the youth, and asked to join it. We measured using the Crime Picks 2 questionnaires, which, as you can see, measures attitudinal actually generates attitudinal measures around, say, the anticipation of offending or victim empathy or evaluation of crime as worthwhile. We use those questionnaires pre and post, and the intervention with the whole intention of measuring the effect size of the music and video workshops. We used the video group as a control group because they were just mentored in video techniques from the BBC, and then we used the music group as a test group who were part of the discussions around race and representation. The video group did make a film of the music project as well. And then we used a map that I developed at HMP YOI Warrington, which is just a map of me, just a 4-quadrant thing where people list the 4 most important issues for them at the time of the interview, give reasons why, and then they do that again, and then we track the movement of importance of issues pre and post the intervention. Very, very useful as a kind of background indicator for the main questionnaire, so that sort of gives some good contextual data. The data is then ranked in order of importance using Spearman's rank, and an effect size measurement is generated from that. Now on to the really interesting bit. So our young people working with the BBC at MMU, you can sort of see them working with local artists, with their songwriting and sketches for their lyrics there. They learn how to film, which is very, very exciting for the apprentice filmmakers, if you will. Them rehearsing for the show at the BBC. So we also worked with the members of the BBC Philharmonic. So very, very exciting project for them. Right, so just a brief summary of findings. And what I'm going to do is just very quickly play you the trailer for the film, where you will kind of hear some of the initial outcomes. Just a trailer for the longer film, but I thought they were more eloquent than myself. So yeah, the findings will be published in a book next year by Roman and Littlefield within the context of the campaign. So getting to the nitty-gritty now of interdisciplinary research in terms of the academy and what that means and its implications for communities. So process measures, the hidden processes that sort of enable knowledge co-production. You know, these processes are absolutely vital for any type of research in a real-world setting with communities. It's all about how do you build relationships, how do you build trust, how do you build your networks. Now, without really paying attention to the dynamics that are inherent in this relationship building process, you sort of are in danger of sort of sabotaging your research, really. And the sad thing about it is that this essential process of relationship building tends to be just swept under the carpet. You know, not very much funding is actually devoted to sorting this out. So to be able to really build relationships with a new community, new to yourself or to me, takes you at least a year to really kind of get into the community. Research projects that are funded by the university, by the councils, and we scrabble for as universities tend not to build that relationship building into the process, with quite disastrous consequences, which we never really get to hear about. So for this project, I decided to really examine that. So I'm going to look at just the two points of clear goals and adequate preparation, just to kind of give you an idea of some of the complexities of working in this interdisciplinary matter in the community. So, clear goals. The reason why we did this project, this music project with the BBC, is because we wanted to highlight the work of the young people and say to the community, well, we need a place for this in the community, and this is the work that the young people are doing. We have a community centre which we need to revitalise. So the project, the BBC project, is very much about giving voice or representation to some of the much needed agency on the ground for the community. So there's a bit of a balancing act, really. So we had to keep the wider Vennela James campaign objectives alive. So the whole thing around the sort of social transformation of the area through these planned services for the building, but also the specific research projects of the music and video project, which we were sort of measuring personal change and attitudes towards offending behaviour. And, you know, there were sort of quite strong tensions between the two. So community partners would be saying, well, look, you really need to make sure that even though it is a research project, but the young people get the maximum out of this project. We're not going to allow you just to do a research project and produce a nice research paper without the young people actually getting anything out of it. And they were quite right. They were really quite right, because in balancing the two, the wider concerns of the community and the research, there were so many institutional barriers that I had to overcome to make that happen. Structural things which even affected the number of sessions that we had available to us, which is crucial because we just about managed to maintain a critical number of sessions that made it worthwhile for the young people. And I say just about. And so, of course, my community partners are saying, well, this isn't the same plan that you and I sat down with, and it is a really truncated version of what we planned. And I'm having to sort of juggle, yes, it is. And I can't help that because of the funding restrictions and the institutional challenges that I'm having to navigate. But I am going to try my utmost to get an optimum number of sessions that will be beneficial to the young people. This is just the sanitized version of that story. There was sort of, yes. So, in terms of adequate preparation, again, the contrasting agendas between the university or our sector and communities really came to the fore. So, as I've written there, the communities were really kind of inspired by Selma James to question everything. And, you know, they wanted to know, well, what the university could do for them, because from their point of view, and the Vennela James Centre kind of signified this as a kind of ruin, if you were, they didn't seem to be marketable to attract the funding to fund the infrastructures in their communities. And I was saying, well, why aren't we getting funding? Why are we constantly being overlooked? And how are you going to help us address that? So are you going to work with us so that we can become more marketable and attractive for further inward investment? Because if you're not, why would we want to work with you? Our neoliberal agendas in terms of looking at funding and research and income generation, but how does that agenda of generating income for research really kind of translate to community benefit? And you go to any community meeting in Whalley Range within the black community with experience of working with MMU and the University of Manchester, and they will tell you flat out that the so-called partnership building that we propose as an ideal just doesn't work for them. So this really kind of got me thinking about the hidden neoliberal agendas of higher education institutions and the funding requirements and how that sort of relates to actual agency and community empowerment on the ground. So universities might not always have the most robust community engagement agendas to be fully responsive to high stakes community needs. Now, what I mean about that is that universities will often have very detailed and robust community agendas, community engagement agendas, but they're not usually relevant to the communities that they're tasked to engage with. The meetings and the arguments, hence the laughter. So that's a really sort of strong message that I get from my communities. So I'm thinking, could our knowledge be used, exchanged or co-produced, more productively in a less market-oriented manner by our community partners? Or do we just need to be really honest and explicit about the nature of the market transaction of it's a project, we're responding to a funding call, you kind of meet the criteria, and that's kind of how it is. At least we're being honest about it, and we're not trying to kind of soft soap them with, yes, you know, it's going to benefit you and all of that, when on the ground it actually really doesn't, 9 times out of 10. So it is a conversation we do need to have about our approach. Following on from that, in our future partnership building activities, you know, we need to really think about how we contribute not just to sharing knowledge, exchanging knowledge with our partners, but we're looking at capital assets as well. You know, for the campaign, when we set up the Selma James Community Action Trust, we didn't have office spaces. So sort of like, Ornette, it's really lovely that you're introducing us to Selma James's theories and his books, but we don't have any offices. So thankfully, in this particular instance, I was able to secure guest login and Wi-Fi access and a locker for our files and stuff. So we were able to use the campus as a virtual office for the campaign. So that was really good. But that actually doesn't happen all the time. So in terms of how we share our assets, really important. I mean, at the moment, we're kind of going through a whole thing about community access to our campus right now, which is incredibly frustrating, which I kind of will leave it at that. But it really does highlight the need for us to be aware of the need to share both our capital and knowledge assets, because, to be honest, communities will say to you, your knowledge is great, it's brilliant, particularly if we want to use your knowledge for evaluation reports to help us get funding. Great, bring it on. But actually, you don't really know what it's like living in this community and the sort of infrastructural challenges that we're facing. So actually, you know, there's nothing you can do for us. So why would we want to work with you? But we want to work with you because you actually have spaces and resources which we need. And we're kind of, as gatekeepers, saying, yes, but. So, you know, huge issues here. Right, zooming on. Project Marley, Manchester, is part of a national research project called Project Marley. And that's looking at the state of African and Caribbean community assets across the country. Why are they being closed down? How is it we're losing them? What are the success stories? What are the, obviously, unsuccessful stories? And Project Marley Manchester is kind of the sort of regional Manchester part of that project. So working with the U Bailey Initiative and Goldsmiths College, who are leading the national project, we formed a forum of social enterprises in Manchester as part of the Project Marley initiative to kind of really look at what we can do, even things like how feasible is it to maybe look into adopting the Hume pound, for instance, and trying to kind of look at sort of economic ways of bringing social enterprises into to cooperation, into sort of making perhaps consortia. Basically, in a way, looking at how we can translate the MEEP model of the consortium of supplementary schools, but sort of citywide with other social enterprises. And then, not really following on, that sort of happening at the same time. So at the same time, the PAC 45 Foundation was set up during the campaign. And the PAC 45 refers to the Pan-African Congress, which the fifth Pan-African Congress was held in Manchester in 1945. So the PAC 45 Foundation was set up to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the Pan-African Congress, the fifth Pan-African Congress. Now, the reason why the fifth Pan-African Congress is really important is because it was the first conference that not only looked at the state of African unity in terms of the continent of Africa and the policies, but it also looked at the international diaspora of peoples of African descent and looked at how they could contribute to that, organised by George Padmore and others. Selma James didn't make it to that particular one. So I'm working with the PAC 45 Foundation. They've got a conference coming up next week, which I'm giving a talk at to do with Selma James. And then running on from that, we're kind of now really kind of hitting our stride in terms of Brexit and the legacy of my scholar activism. So with PAC 45 and MEEP and other social enterprises, I'm part of a national coalition called the International Decade of Peoples of African Descent Coalition, IDPAD UK Coalition. So right now we're just entering a United Nations International Decade of Peoples of African Descent, really looking at the structural inequalities that peoples of African descent face around the world. Now, in terms of the UK, we have submitted evidence to the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And that meeting was in Geneva 3 months ago. And they wrote a report published or available through the Runnymede Trust, whom we are also working with, race and ethnicity think tank. And the recommendations for the UK were part of the influence behind Theresa May's call for an audit on race and equality. So this is the concluding slide. So from Selma James and this sort of interdisciplinary mode of working, looking at forming a bridge between the academy and the community, looking at how we actually draw the wider sort of stakeholders and power brokers into the mix, and how the academy has a part to play with that, or in that. Yeah, it really kind of sums up community activism via scholar activism and political networking for agency and community change. And I put a question mark at the end of that because it isn't a done deal, really. It's incredible. Even this coalition, this IDPAD coalition, we managed to secure 80 organisations as part of the coalition to write an open letter to Theresa May to recognise the International Decade. And the conflicting agendas of the 80 of us, it's just an absolute nightmare. But we're working our way through it. But you know, the book is important to me because when I chose to focus on the polemics of Selma James, I deliberately sidestepped his cultural criticisms because they're quite well examined and well published. But his polemics, his polemical articles aren't. And he's at his most visceral and at his most honest when he's responding to the goings-on of his day and all of the kind of political manoeuvrings. So, you know, for instance, when Italy invaded what they called Abyssinia back in the day in 1939, I think it was, Ethiopia, and that was the rallying call for the black intellectuals, W.B. Du Bois, or Du Bois as the Americans call him, Georgie Padmore, himself, and Marcus Garvey, Philip A. Randolph, all of these kind of luminaries, to come together because of what they thought was a betrayal of Europe towards the last state of Africa that wasn't colonized at that point. And when you read his articles, you kind of realize just how messy it was, just all of the different agendas, all of the, you know, Marcus Garvey was absolutely hated by his contemporaries because they found him too extreme and thought that his work was just too radical and fundamental to be of any use to the emerging civil rights movement. I say emerging because in terms of the things that were going on in the 40s, it was very much about workers' rights, about African Americans forming their own trades unions and sort of getting that, and that kind of laid the foundation for the civil rights movement of the 60s. So anyway, very, very messy. And as a scholar activist, I feel that in order to work effectively within all of this mess, I have to be incredibly flexible and have a sort of wide range of interests and curiosities and emerging expertises to be able to keep up with the developments on the ground, which can move, not can, they do move incredibly rapidly and rather confusingly. So I think scholar activism, I think lost that tradition recently, probably when we became too comfortable, probably in the 90s and in the noughties. We saw the tradition of scholar activism during the civil rights movement, both in the UK and obviously in America and around the world actually. But I think with Brexit, and with what's going on now, particularly in America, the whole Black Lives Matter movement, which I write about, and its UK equivalent, I think we are now witnessing a resurgence in the sort of academic who is embedded in the community and is making those connections between theory and practice for the empowerment of communities. We're not quite there yet, but I was talking at a wonderful conference called Decolonize Brum in Birmingham at the Birmingham Impact Centre around decoloniality and the whole range of issues that kind of came under that heading of decolonizing was just it was a sight to behold, really, and you could really see the merging of the academy with the community in a really vibrant way. So that is my little scrapbook of my work. Thank you.
So 1, 2, 3, so then all the hands go up. Yeah, go on.
It was interesting that the mention of the Italian aggression against Ethiopia, because back at home in the resistance to fascism, there was Antonio Gramsci, who had this wonderful notion of the organic intellectual.
Yes.
I kind of wondered whether you kind of thought about that concept and to what extent it applies or is applicable to kind of work you're doing. My understanding of what the organic intellectual is that that's the person who is much more part of a social movement than perhaps somebody with their feet in the university, and yet I could see some value in the concept to explore kind of what you're doing.
Can you take the three together? Is that all right?
Course, yeah, okay.
So there was.
Thank you for that, very inspiring. It's just a comment really, it was thinking about the kind of the terms in developing a discourse, you've coined a term, the scholar activist. I don't know whether that's yours or whether
No,
that's been around.
not
It's
mine.
been around for a while.
Yeah.
It's made me think of other things that I've been reading recently. The kind of civic university, the scholar activist.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the kind of neoliberal university,
Yes.
throughout. And it was just kind of and I think what you did throughout your show is kind of juxtaposition those type of concepts.
Mm-hmm.
And it's how the university, I suppose, resists that kind of neoliberal agenda in developing these ideas of a scholar activist, the civic university, that I suppose gets beyond the kind of partnership. I mean, that has been one of the traits of neoliberalism, I suppose, from one level. So just a comment.
Okay,
I'll
just
come back
one
to that.
more, and this is embarrassing when you know the names of the people who asked the questions. It feels like a bit exclusive. Yes, Barney.
It was just maybe a practical thing about the sort of disagreements that you described around the sort of truncating of the CLR James project and how you just managed to sort of have enough provision to really benefit the young people. And I was just wondering whether how much that has to do with how you manage the expectations when you're kind of negotiating projects like that. Because it sounds like, we didn't go into a lot of detail, but it sounds like they had unrealistic expectations, and that somehow you had either encouraged that or permitted them to have expectations which you weren't able, or the institution and the structural limits of the institution weren't able to live up to. So I suppose the question is how do we manage expectations when we're working in communities in a way that to a level you can deliver, whilst also maintaining the investment and engagement of participants?
I am absolutely going to jump on that. If we look at managing expectations in terms of what institutions can realistically deliver, we wouldn't deliver, to be quite frank. So we actually have to have quite high expectations. Now, the problems that I faced were structural, and what made them really frustrating is that they were structural problems that should not have been there. So they were unforeseen. It wasn't sort of like I was expecting the Vice-Chancellor to come and do some breakdancing to kind of... There were kind of structures which were identified as viable, but at the last minute became unviable, which is incredibly frustrating. So it's about how do you dance with that and still make it work. So, but in terms of my expectations, I have to say the communities I work with have incredibly high expectations. They're kind of very sick of people assuming low expectations for them. So I'm willing to do my utmost to kind of try and live up to those high expectations for them.
Just an observation, sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
It sounds to me like what you were saying is that in their role,
Yes.
then the risk is, and you're prepared to go with the risk is that the organisation that kind of houses you will break faith with the project. So what appears to be a deal isn't always a deal.
No.
And therefore you are working across different boundaries.
Absolutely. And how do you learn from that? And build infrastructures within the organisation to perhaps account for that for other projects, which is kind of a big challenge. Sorry, your point, what? Neoliberalism.
The juxtaposition between the civic university, the scholar activist, and the neoliberal university, which I think, you
One thing that I would suggest, it is really, really simplistic, but it is just kind of, I genuinely believe this. Rather than us having to respond to predefined calls from research councils, where we have to then somehow scrabble around and form some sort of research plan to match the call, a really simple solution would be for us to be allowed to make those relationships, have those relationships with our community partners, write proposals, and then submit them to the funding councils to say, this is what we've been working on for a year in terms of our relationship building. These are the areas that have been identified of mutual benefit. can we have some money for it? Rather than the other way around, where we're having to kind of squeeze ourselves into a straitjacket, which isn't always appropriate. It's simplistic, but I think that would change everything, actually. Organic intellectual. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. My community partners would probably be more interested, not more interested, but would be perhaps more inclined to think in terms of people like Selma James and Marcus Garvey even. In the conference, Impact 45, fundamental Garveyism came up through one of the speakers, Dr. Umar Johnson, who is especially extreme about his political views of integration. And I think that sort of intellectual discourse where people like myself and other people were arguing with him and saying, well, actually, that's not quite right. I think that level of discourse, I think we have a homegrown version of that organic intellectual model, which I think my community partners would be more interested in following. And of course, Selma James was that, exactly. But in essence, yes, of course, yeah. And I kind of see myself as a kind of embryonic form of that tradition.
Because I could just come back on that very quickly. Because
yeah.
In Gramsci's analysis, that was counterposed to the intellectuals in the priesthood, in
yeah.
the bourgeois professions and so on.
Yeah.
And I suppose our modern equivalent of that could be the academics, who are, if you like, the neoliberal priests.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So it poses some interesting kind of conflicts, I guess.
It really does. And, you know, especially if you're trying to get... So this is from the point of view of the academy. As an academic, working in this way, and I broadly described the model, the flipped academic, broadly, trying to get that acknowledged and appreciated and valorised by your institution is a nightmare. It really is. So that also kind of puts constraints on what you can do, but you've just got to try and push through that and try and find a way somehow.
I'm really
of course, yeah.
But can we carry on the conversation downstairs? Is that okay? Would that be all right? Yeah? Okay, but thank you again.
Thank you.